everyone, and welcome to Soft Stories. I'm Stratton, and this is Pepper, and today we are going to be continuing our reading of 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea by Jules Verne. When last we left our hero, Monsieur Aronnax, he had been flung into the ocean after an attack by what everyone had suspected was a massive narwhal. But a strange narwhal, indeed, 150 feet long, with phosphorescent glows that it can activate and deactivate at any moment that it wants, and the ability to swim away at upwards of 30 knots, much faster than the state-of-the-art SS Abraham Lincoln. What is this strange creature, and how will Monsieur Aronnax survive this descent over the railings and into the briny sea? Let's find out as we start our story today with Chapter 7, An Unknown Species of Whale. Even though I was surprised by this unexpected fall, I still have a very clear memory of my sensations at the time. I was, first of all, dragged down to a depth of about 20 feet. I am a good swimmer, although I couldn't pretend to equal Byron or Edgar Allan Poe, who are masters of the art. And this dive did not make me lose my head. 2 strong kicks brought me back to the surface. My first thought was to try to find the frigate. Had the crew noticed my disappearance? Had the Abraham Lincoln come about? Was Commander Farragut putting a lifeboat to sea? Did I have any chance of being saved? I was surrounded by total darkness, but I could make out a vague black shape disappearing toward the east, its riding lights slowly fading as it got farther away. I felt I was done for. "Help! Help!" I cried as I swam desperately toward the Abraham Lincoln. My clothes began to get in the way. The water was making them stick to my body, paralyzing my movements. I was sinking. I was drowning. "Help!" It was my last shout, my mouth filled with water. I struggled against being dragged down to the depths. Suddenly, a powerful hand grabbed my clothes. I felt myself violently brought back to the surface, and then heard, yes, heard, the following words spoken in my ear. "If monsieur would be so extremely kind as to lean on my shoulder, monsieur would be able to swim much more comfortably." I seized the arm of my faithful Conseil. It's you." "Yes," answered Conseil, "awaiting monsieur's orders." "Did the crash throw you into the water along with me?" "Not at all. But being in monsieur's service, I followed monsieur." This worthy fellow seemed to think this was all perfectly natural. "And the frigate?" I asked. "The frigate?" replied Conseil, rolling over on his back. "I think monsieur would be wise not to count on that too much." "What do you mean?" "I mean that when I was getting ready to jump into the water, I heard the men at the helm shouting, 'The propeller blade and the rudder are broken.'" Broken? Yes, broken by the monster's tusk. As far as I could make out, this was the only damage sustained by the Abraham Lincoln. But what is unpleasant for us is that she no longer answers her helm. That means we're done for. Perhaps, Conseil answered calmly. Nevertheless, we still have several hours, and one can do a lot of things in several hours. Conseil's unshakable coolness gave me courage. I was swimming more vigorously now, but I was still hampered by the clothes clinging to me like a lead cloak, and I found it very difficult to stay afloat. Conseil noticed this. With Monsieur's permission, I will make an incision, he said. With this, he slipped a knife inside my clothes and split them open from top to bottom with one fast sweep. Then he quickly took them off me, while I swam for both of us. Then I, in turn, did the same for Conseil, and we continued to navigate next to one another. But the situation was still just as terrifying. Perhaps our disappearance had not been noticed, and even if it had, the frigate could not maneuver to leeward towards us, since it had no rudder. So our only hope was lifeboats. Conseil reasoned all this out coolly and laid his plans accordingly. What an extraordinary character. This impassive fellow was acting no differently than if he were sitting in the living room of his house. We decided that since our only chance of rescue lay in being picked up by the lifeboats of the Abraham Lincoln, we ought to manage so as to be able to wait for them as long as possible. I resolved to divide our forces so we would not both become exhausted at the same time, and this is what we decided to do. While one of us would stretch out on his back with his arms crossed and his legs extended, the other would push him forward. But this was to last no longer than 10 minutes, after which we would change roles. And alternating thus, we could remain afloat for several hours, and perhaps until daybreak. Our chances remained slim, but hope springs eternal in the human breast. Besides, there were two of us, and, improbable as it may seem, I must admit that even though I tried to destroy all illusion and give myself over to despair, I could not. The collision between the frigate and the whale had taken place at about 11 at night. I therefore estimated we would have to swim 8 hours before sunrise. This was just barely possible, taking turns as we did. The sea was calm and tired us little. Occasionally, I would try to peer through the thick darkness, which was broken only by the phosphorescence produced by our movements in the water. I would look at the luminous waves as they splashed over my head, their glistening surface broken only by pale splotches. It was as if we had dived into a bath of mercury. Toward 1 in the morning, a dreadful tiredness came over me. Violent cramps seized my legs. Conseil had to hold me up, and the responsibility of keeping us alive rested with him alone. I soon heard the poor fellow panting. I realized he could not hold out much longer. "Let me go. Let me go," I said. "Abandon, monsieur?" "Never," he answered. "I would prefer to drown first." Just then, the moon appeared over the edge of a large cloud being blown toward the east. The surface of the sea sparkled beneath its rays. This bountiful light restored our strength. I once more held up my head. I looked around at every corner of the horizon. I caught sight of the frigate. She was 5 miles away, and we could make out little more than a vague shape. But there were no lifeboats. I tried to shout, even though it would have done no good at that distance. My swollen lips allowed no sound to come out. Conseil was able to articulate several words, and I heard him repeat several times, "Help! Help!" We lay still in the water for a moment and listened. It might only have been a ringing in my ear, but it seemed as if I heard someone answer Conseil's shout. "Did you hear that?" I murmured. "Yes, yes." And Conseil gave one more desperate shout. This time, there could be no doubt about it. A human voice was answering ours. Was it the voice of some other poor soul abandoned in mid-ocean, some other victim of the collision? Or was it a lifeboat from the frigate, hailing us in the darkness? Conseil made a supreme effort, and leaning on my shoulder while I stayed afloat with my last ounce of strength, he raised himself half out of the water and then fell back, exhausted. "What did you see?" "I saw," he murmured. "I saw. Better not talk. Got to keep our strength." What had he seen? Then, I don't know why, the thought of the monster crossed my mind for the first time. But what about the voice? In this day and age, there were no longer any Jonahs taking refuge in the bellies of whales. Meanwhile, Conseil was still pushing me along. He would occasionally lift up his head, look out in front, and let out a shout. He would be answered by a voice, getting nearer and nearer, but I could scarcely hear it. I was at the end of my tether. My fingers became stiff. I could no longer use my hand for support. My mouth began opening convulsively and filling with seawater. A chill crept through my body. I lifted my head one last time, and then I began to sink. Just then, something hard knocked against me. I grabbed onto it. I felt something dragging me, bringing me back to the surface, but my chest was collapsing, and I passed out. I must have regained consciousness quickly, thanks to someone giving me a strong massage. I half opened my eyes. "Conseil," I murmured. "Did Monsieur call for me?" replied Conseil. Just then, by the fading light of the moon sinking down toward the horizon, I made out a face which wasn't Conseil's, but which I immediately recognized. "Ned!" I cried. "Yes, it's me, still chasing my prize," answered the Canadian. "Were you also thrown into the sea by the collision?" "Yes, Professor, but I was a little luckier than you, and I was able to stand on a floating island right away." "A floating island?" Or, to put it another way, on our giant narwhal." "What do you mean, Ned?" "Only, I soon saw why my harpoon hadn't been able to penetrate, and why it had only been blunted on its skin." "Why, Ned? Why?" "Because the critter is covered with steel plates." At this point in my story, I must gather myself together, clarify my memory, and make doubly sure of my statements. The Canadian's last words had produced a turmoil in my mind. I quickly climbed to the top of the half-submerged creature or object which was serving as our place of refuge. I felt it with my foot. It was obviously something hard and impenetrable, and not made out of the soft flesh which covers marine mammals. But this hard exterior could be no more than a bony shell, like that of prehistoric animals, and I could then easily class the monster among amphibious reptiles, such as turtles or alligators. But no. The blackish back supporting me was smooth and polished rather than rough. When struck, it gave off a metallic noise, and as unbelievable as it seemed, it was made out of bolted-down plates. There was no longer any room for doubt. The animal, the monster, the phenomenon of nature that had intrigued the whole scientific world, confused and misled seamen of both hemispheres, I now had to admit, was something even more astounding. It was the work of man. Had I discovered some truly fabulous, mythological creature, it would not have come as a greater shock to me. It was quite easy to believe that God had created something prodigious, but suddenly to find, before one's very eyes, the impossible realized by mysterious human means, that truly was a staggering thought. But there was no question about it. We were stretched out on the back of some sort of underwater boat, built, as far as I could make out, in the form of a huge steel fish. Ned Land had already made up his mind about this. Conseil and I could only agree with him. "So," I said, "this thing must contain some means of locomotion, and a crew to guide it."
"Obviously," replied the harpooner. "But all the same, in the 3 hours I've spent on this floating island, it hasn't given a single sign of life."
"It hasn't moved?"
"No, Monsieur Aronnax. It's just laid here, rocked by the waves, without budging."
We know, however, that it is capable of movement, and there can be no doubt about it, of great speed. Therefore, since such a speed must be produced by an engine, and an engine requires a mechanic to run it, I conclude that we've been saved.
Said Ned Land reservedly.
Just then, as if to prove me right, there was a swirling in the water to the rear of this strange thing, undoubtedly produced by a propeller, and it began moving. We barely had time to take a good hold on its topside, which was only about 2.5 feet above water level.
"As long as it cruises on the surface," Ned Land murmured, "we'll be all right. But if it takes it into its head to dive, I wouldn't give $2 for my life."
He could have made the price even lower. It had therefore become urgent to communicate with whatever creatures were inside this machine. I tried to find some opening or hatch, but I could only see steel plates fastened by even, unbroken lines of bolts. Moreover, the moon then disappeared, leaving us in total darkness. We were forced to wait until daybreak to find some means of getting inside the submarine. Thus, our lives depended completely on the whims of the men at the helm of this machine, and if they decided to dive, we were lost. Unless this happened, I was sure we would eventually be able to communicate with them. Moreover, unless they manufactured their own air, they were forced to return to the surface from time to time to renew their supply of oxygen. There must, therefore, be some opening between the inside of the submarine and the outside atmosphere. As for the hope of being saved by Commander Farragut, we had to give up all thought of that. We were being taken off to the west, and I estimated we were traveling at the relatively moderate speed of 12 knots. The propeller was churning the water in an absolutely regular rhythm, occasionally rising above the surface and sending columns of phosphorescent water to great heights. Toward 4 in the morning, it started to go faster. We were soon travelling at a headlong speed, and it became difficult to hang on with the waves crashing into us. Luckily, Ned found a large mooring ring attached to the upper part of its steel-plated back, and we were able to get a firm hold on it. Finally, this long night came to an end. My incomplete memory of it does not permit me to recount all my impressions. Only one detail comes to mind. During certain moments, when the sea was calm, I occasionally thought I could hear vague sounds of music, a sort of fleeting harmony produced by far-off chords. What mystery lay behind this underwater boat, about which the entire world had been vainly seeking an explanation? What sort of creatures lived inside this strange ship? What sort of engine permitted it to travel so fast? Then dawn came. For a while we were wrapped in morning mists, but it was not long before they began breaking up. I was about to start a careful examination of the submarine's topside, which formed a kind of horizontal platform, when I felt it starting to go down, little by little.
"Confound it!" cried Ned Land, striking the steel plates with his foot. "Open up! Show us a little hospitality!"
But it was difficult to make ourselves heard in the midst of the deafening beat of the propeller. Luckily, the ship stopped diving. Suddenly there was a loud clanking noise from inside the submarine. One of the plates rose up. A man appeared, uttered a strange cry, and quickly disappeared. Several moments later, 8 solidly built young men with masked faces came silently out on deck and brought us inside their formidable machine. Chapter 8. Mobilis in Mobile. This operation of taking us below was carried out roughly and at the speed of lightning. Neither my friends nor I had time to realize what was happening. I don't know how they felt as they were being brought into that floating prison, but as for me, a chill went down my spine. What sort of people were we dealing with? Undoubtedly some new kind of pirates, roaming the sea in their own fashion. The hatch had barely closed behind me when I was surrounded by total darkness. My eyes, still under the influence of strong daylight, could make out nothing. I could feel my feet clinging to the rungs of an iron ladder. Behind me were Ned and Conseil, also held firmly by masked men. At the bottom of the ladder, a door opened and immediately closed behind us with a loud clang. We were alone. Where? I couldn't say, or scarcely imagine. The darkness surrounding us was so total that after several minutes I could only make out some vague glow floating about in the blackest of nights. Ned Land, however, was furious with having been treated this way, and he gave free rein to his indignation.
"Confound them!" he cried. "These people are hospitable as a bunch of Caledonians. They're probably nothing better than cannibals. It wouldn't surprise me one bit. But let me tell you, I'll give them some trouble before they eat me."
"Calm down, Ned. Calm down," Conseil said quietly. "Don't get carried away beforehand. We're not stewing in a pot yet."
"Maybe not," replied the Canadian, "but it certainly looks like it. It's black enough in here to be the inside of a pot. But I've still got my Bowie knife with me, and I can still see well enough to use it. The first bandit who lays a hand on me."
"Don't get so excited, Ned," I said to the harpooner, "and don't make our situation worse with useless violence. How do we know somebody isn't listening to us? Instead, let's try and find out where we are." I walked, with my arms stretched out before me. After 5 steps, I bumped into an iron wall made of plates bolted together. I then turned around and knocked against a wooden table with several stools next to it. The floor of this prison was covered with a thick linen mat which muffled the noise of our steps. The bare walls revealed no trace of a door or window. Conseil, going around the room in the opposite direction, finally met me, and we came back to the middle of the cabin. It must have been about 20 feet long and 10 feet wide. As for his height, Ned Land, in spite of his great size, could not touch the ceiling. A half an hour went by, without event, when suddenly, from near total darkness, we were subjected to blinding light. Our prison was suddenly lit up, or, that is to say, it became filled with a light so bright that at first I could not stand it. By its whiteness and intensity, I recognized it as being the same electric light that had produced that magnificent effect of phosphorescence around the submarine. After being forced to close my eyes for a while, I opened them again and could see that the light was coming from a frosted half-globe in the ceiling of the cabin.
"Finally, we can see,"
cried Ned Land, who was standing with his knife in his hand, ready for anything. "Yes," I said, "but we're still just as much in the dark about our situation." "Monsieur must be patient," said the imperturbable Conseil. The sudden lighting up of the cabin had permitted me to examine it carefully. It contained nothing but the table and 5 stools. The door was invisible and probably hermetically sealed. No sound reached our ears. Everything seemed dead inside the boat. Was it going forward, staying on the surface, or diving down into the ocean depths? There was no way of knowing. But there must have been some reason for the light being turned on. This seemed to indicate that some of the crew would turn up soon, for if you want to forget about people, you don't light up their cells. I turned out not to be wrong. There was a noise of bolts, the door opened, and 2 men appeared. One of them was short, but powerfully built, with broad shoulders, strong arms and legs, a large head, thick black hair, a big moustache, and a lively, penetrating eye. His whole personality seemed full of that vitality which characterizes the people of southern France. One felt, too, that his speech must have been colorful and spicy, but I was never able to verify this, for in front of me he always spoke in a strange and completely incomprehensible language. The other person deserves a more detailed description. A disciple of Gratiolet or Engel would have been able to read his face like an open book. I could easily make out his dominant characteristics: self-confidence, from the fine way his head was set on his shoulders, and from his cold look of assurance; calm, because his rather pale skin showed his coolness of blood; energy, evinced by the rapid way he would contract his eyebrows; and finally courage, for his deep breathing indicated an expansive, vital nature. In addition, this man was proud. His firm, calm look seemed to reflect thoughts of high nature, and one could see in everything, in his bodily and facial movements, an undeniable openness of manner. I felt myself involuntarily reassured in his presence, and I predicted that our interview would have a favorable outcome. Whether he was 35 or 50, I could not tell. He was tall, with a broad forehead, a straight nose, firm mouth, splendid teeth, and delicate hands, slender and long. Eminently psychical, to use a term from palmistry, or in other words, worthy of serving a high-minded, passionate soul. This man seemed one of the most admirable I had ever met. One strange detail: his eyes, which were rather far apart, had an almost 90-degree range of vision. This ability, I was later able to verify it, was backed by eyesight, even better than Ned Land's. When this man fixed his look upon some object, he would frown and squint in such a way as to limit his range of vision, and then he would look. And what a look! How he could magnify objects made smaller by distance, how he could penetrate to your very soul, how he could pierce the surface of the water, so impenetrable to our eyes, and read the ocean depths. The two strangers wore otter-skin caps, sealskin boots, and clothes made out of some special material which hung loosely from their bodies, giving them great freedom of movement. The taller of the two, obviously the captain of the ship, examined us very carefully, without saying a word. He then turned to his companion and said something in a language I didn't recognize. It was a sonorous, harmonious, supple language, the vowels of which seemed to undergo a wide variety of accentuation. The other answered with a nod, and added 2 or 3 totally incomprehensible words. He then looked at me as if he were questioning me directly. I replied in French that I didn't understand his language, but he did not seem to understand me, and the situation became awkward. "Monsieur might try to tell our story anyhow," Conseil said to me. "These gentlemen will perhaps understand a few words of it." I began reciting our adventure, pronouncing each word very carefully and without omitting a single detail. I told them our names and positions, then formally presented us to them: Professor Aronnax, his servant Conseil, and Ned Land, master harpooner. The man with the calm, gentle eyes listened to me silently, politely, and with remarkable attention, but nothing in his facial expression showed that he had understood my story. When I had finished, he didn't say a word. I could still try talking English. Perhaps I could make myself understood in this almost universal language. I knew English as well as I knew German. That is to say, well enough to read it fluently, but not well enough to speak it correctly. But in this situation, we above all had to make ourselves understood. All right, it's your turn, I told the harpooner. Whip out your best English and see if you have better luck than I did. Ned, without hesitating, began our story all over again, and I could understand almost every word. It was basically the same, but differed in details. Being more emotional, the Canadian told it in a much livelier fashion. He complained bitterly of being imprisoned without regard to people's rights, asked what they had thought they were doing in locking us up like this, invoking the law of habeas corpus, threatening to bring them to court, flailing about, gesticulating, shouting, and finally, with a very expressive gesture, made it clear that we were dying of hunger. And this was perfectly true, even though we had almost completely forgotten about it. To his great amazement, the harpooner seemed to have been no better understood than I. Our visitors did not bat an eyelid. It was obvious they understood neither the language of Arago nor that of Faraday. Having thus exhausted our resources of language in vain, we were very puzzled. I no longer knew what to do when suddenly Conseil said to me, "With Monsieur's permission, I could tell our story in German." "What? You know German?" I cried. "No better than most Belgians, by Monsieur's leave." "Fine. Go ahead, my boy." And then Conseil, in a calm voice, recounted for the third time the various details of our story. But in spite of his elegant turns of phrase and good accent, German proved equally unsuccessful. Finally, at my wits' end, I gathered together the remains of my early schooling and started out narrating our adventure in Latin. Cicero would have blocked his ears and sent me off to the kitchen, but I managed to get through it. The result was the same. After this last attempt had come to nothing, the two strangers exchanged a few words in their strange language and went out, without even making one of those reassuring gestures known the world over. The door closed behind them.
"This is disgraceful,"
cried Ned Land, bursting out for the 20th time.
"We talked to those English idiots in French, English, German, and Latin, and neither of them had the good grace to answer us."
"Calm down, Ned," I told the raging harpoonist. "Anger will get you nowhere."
"But can't you see, Professor," said our irascible companion, "that we're going to die of starvation in this iron cage?"
"Nonsense," said Conseil philosophically. "We can still hold out for a long time." "We mustn't despair, my friends," I said. "We've been in worse situations than this. So please, do me the favor of waiting a while before you form an opinion of the captain and crew of this boat."
"My mind's completely made up," replied Ned Land. "They're nothing but a bunch of scoundrels."
"All right, then. What country are they from?"
"Scoundrel Land."
"That's all very well and good, Ned, but that country hasn't yet been clearly marked on maps, and I must admit that it's very difficult to try and figure out just where they are from. They're neither English, French, or German. That's all we can say for sure. All the same, I'd be tempted to say they're from some southern region, but whether they're Spaniards, Turks, Arabs, or Indians, it's impossible to tell from their appearance. As for their language, I can't understand a word of it." That is the disadvantage of not knowing every language, answered Conseil, or of not having a world language.
Even that wouldn't do any good, replied Ned Land. Can't you see that these people have made up their own private language just to annoy perfectly decent people who want a bite to eat? But in every country of the world, when you open your mouth, move your jaw up and down, and click your teeth together, and smack your lips, isn't that something everybody can understand? Whether you're in Quebec, Tuamotu, Paris, or the North Pole, doesn't that mean I'm hungry? Give me something to eat.
Yes, said Conseil, but some people are so stupid that they... In the middle of this sentence, the door opened. A steward entered. He brought us underwear, coats, and sailors' pants, all made out of cloth I did not recognize. I got into them quickly, and my companions did the same. Meanwhile, the steward, who was mute or perhaps deaf, had set the table for 3. "Ah, this is more like it," said Conseil.
Bah, retorted the begrudging harpooner. What kind of stuff do you think we'll get? Probably turtle liver, shark fillet, or dogfish steaks.
"We'll see," said Conseil. The dishes, with their silver covers, were placed symmetrically on the tablecloth, and we sat down to eat. There was no doubt about it. We were in the hands of civilized people, and except for the electric light, I would have thought myself in the Adelphi Hotel in Liverpool or the Grand Hotel in Paris. I must admit, however, that there was no bread or wine. The water was fresh and clear, but it was only water, which wasn't much to Ned's liking. Among the things offered, I could recognize various delicately prepared fish, but there were certain dishes which, although excellent, were completely unfamiliar to me, and I could not even have said to what kingdom, animal or vegetable, their contents belonged. As for the dinner service, it was elegant and in perfect taste. Each utensil, spoons, forks, knives, and plates, had engraved on it a letter surrounded by a motto which looked like this. There we can see the motto of this strange vessel and its crew, a sort of stylized N, with that motto we heard at the opening of this chapter, Mobilis in Mobile. Mobile in Mobile element. This motto corresponded perfectly to the submarine itself, on the condition that one translated the preposition in by in and not on. The letter N was undoubtedly the initial of the enigmatic person who commanded this ship as it sailed through the ocean depths. Ned and Conseil spent little time worrying about such things. They devoured their food, and I soon did the same. Moreover, I felt reassured about our fate, and it seemed obvious that our hosts did not want us to be let die by starvation. Nevertheless, everything in this world passes and comes to an end, even the hunger of people who have not eaten for 15 hours. Once we had had our fill, we felt a great urge to sleep. But this was quite natural, considering we had spent an entire night struggling against death. "It certainly is going to be a pleasure to sleep," said Conseil.
Me too,
replied Ned Land. My 2 companions stretched out on the floor of the cabin, and soon they were sound asleep. As for me, I felt the same strong need to rest, but I gave in to it less easily. Too many thoughts crowded into my mind, too many insoluble questions occupied my brain, too many ideas kept my eyelids half open. Where were we? What strange power carried us forward? I felt, or rather I thought I felt, the ship dive into the deepest layers of the ocean. I was beset by dreadful nightmares. In mysterious sanctuaries, I saw whole worlds of unknown animals, of species seemingly related to the submarine, living, moving, and terrifying. Then my brain grew calmer. My imagination became lost in a vague drowsiness, and I soon fell into a deep sleep. And that, my friends, seems like the perfect place to pause today. What a marvelous thing this strange submarine is. It seems utterly fantastic to think that such a thing might have been possible in the 1800s. Today we are so aware in the zeitgeist of the idea of submarines, though I can't say I have ever travelled leagues beneath the sea on one. But for the people who first read this book, it must have been eye-opening and mind-blowing. That's one of the things I really like about reading old books like this, is thinking about them not only from our own modern perspective, but of thinking about the way that they would have been received in their time. The consideration of the thoughts, opinions, and feelings of other people is an important skill, and I try to keep it sharp. Thank you so much for joining me today on Soft Stories. I hope you have enjoyed this reading and will look forward to next time when we continue our reading of 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea by Jules Verne. Until next we meet, though, I must leave you. But until such time, I wish you all the best, and goodbye.